Hi everyone, it's Erin from the Provincial Farmhouse. In today's video, I've put together a collection of Halloween decor DIYs to get you inspired for the coming spooky season. For today's projects, I'm going to be using thrifted books that I got for a few dollars each, and they are all hardcover. I find these to be the best to work with. My first step is to give each book 2 coats of Dixie Belle's Coffee Bean Chalk Mineral Paint. This is a beautiful black that has a hint of brown. It is definitely one of my favorite blacks to use, and it has great coverage. My second coat is going to be very light. For the edges, I'm going to take a small artist's brush to do my painting here. I don't want to get too much paint on the inside of the cover, but I definitely need to do this because you can see the coloured part when the book is still closed. You can find a full product list in the description below and all these products on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. Next, I'm going to seal each of these books with Dixie Belle's flat clear coat. I like to seal my paint before I do any stamping because I'm able to come in with a wet wipe and fix any small errors. For my first book design, I'm going to be using this beautiful floral urn from the Reverie stamp by Iron Orchid Designs. So I'm going to peel that design off and I'm going to put it on a sheet of plastic that comes with your stamps. You can also use a thin mount for this. And then I'm going to be using some ink. Now this is a gold ink that I picked up from a shop here in Australia called Officeworks. I will link it below for my Australian watchers. Otherwise, I know Amazon does sell a few different gold inks. I'm then going to position my stamp where I want it on my book and then carefully press down. Remember to always have one hand holding that stamp in place and then lift straight up. This is not IOD ink, so I'm not going to get the same definition, but I wanted to do something different, so I'm loving the gold ink for this craft. I'm then grabbing another couple of elements from the Reverie stamp and positioning it down below. You can see these mirror each other. They are a beautiful design, and you can see that I position them on the book first before pressing my plastic down so that I have them in the right spot. I'll then ink them up just like before, and if I get any of the gold ink where I don't want it, I have a wet wipe there to wipe off any excess, and then again positioning it where I want it to go and pressing down. I'm then going to be using one of IOD's older stamp designs. This is from the Knob Toppers stamp, and I've just selected one of the designs from there. It's a lovely round ornate design, and I felt like it would look really nice between the 2 scroll designs that we already have. So I'm going to carefully position that down the bottom and press down. I then decided that I would repeat the same elements up the top but just turn them around so that the scrolls were facing down. So repeating the same steps as before, positioning them and carefully pressing down. I'm then using one of the elements from the Reverie stamp. This is one of the border designs that's in that pack, and I'm going to go around the edges and carefully press down. I don't mind if this isn't perfect. I'm really envisioning here that this book has old gold embossing that's weathered and aged over time, so we don't need it to be perfect. I'm then going to use the Knob Topper stamp again. I grabbed this design that had some lettering on it. I wanted the name because I thought it would work well as an author's name, but you can see I've inked it up and now I'm using a wet wipe to wipe back the parts of the stamp that I don't want to use, and then I'm going to position it where I want it to go and then press down. I'm going to add that same round element from the front of the books as well on the spine. I feel like that will tie the project together nicely. I'm also using that same border stamp from the Reverie stamp design, and I'm just going to do a little bit of stamping on the spine. Unfortunately, the IOD letter stamps were a little bit too big for this project, so I just have this stamp set here from Amazon. I will try and link it below if I can find it. And I'm just going to have a little bit of fun here, and we're going to spell out the words poisonous plants. Remember, these are Halloween inspired. We want them to be a little bit spooky, and I'm not going to get this lettering perfect here. It's a bit tricky to line these up perfectly. The stamps are not perfect, but I'm just going to go with it and embrace it. If you're going to try this project at home, obviously you could put some other sort of lettering on the spine of the book. I went with poisonous plants here because I felt like it tied in with the plants in the urn that we have on the center on the front of the book. For the back of the book, I'm going to use another element from the Reverie stamp. I'm going to ink up part of a stamp design, and I'm going to stamp one on one side and repeat the same process and have it on the other side, like they're mirroring each other. For our second book, I'm going to take that same stamp that we just used on the back of the first book. You can see I'm inking up half of the design here, and then I'm going to put it up the top of the book and then carefully press down. So remember, you don't have to use the stamps as is. You can pick bits and pieces of the stamp that you want to use, and it really does transform the look that they create. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your craft projects. So I've added that design to the top, and I'm adding it to the bottom of the book as well. I'm then going to be using IOD's letterpress stamp, and I'm going to be spelling out the words Book of Spells. Again, we're having a little bit of fun here for Halloween, and you can see I lined up the letters where I wanted them to go, and I'm using a thin mount to do my stamping here. So I'm repeating the same process each time, positioning the letters where I want them to go, using a thin mount with the lines to guide me, and then inking them up and carefully pressing down. Obviously, wherever I have missing letters, I need to keep that in mind and leave a space. If you don't have the same stamps that I'm using today for my lettering, you could definitely use a different brand of stamps. You saw me use some Amazon stamps before. I felt like this scale of these were very good for a book cover, or you could use some stencils alternatively as well. For the spine of the book, I've grabbed an element from the Queen Bee stamp. I'm inking it up, and then I am wiping off any excess ink that I don't want. I'm going to turn the book on its side and carefully press down. I do miss a spot here, so I've gone back in and I'm just fixing that up the best I can. I'm then going to use another part of that same stamp, this beautiful scroll sort of a design, and I'm going to press that on the spine as well. I did get a bit of smudging here. This ink is not the same as IOD, it's not the same quality, so you can't really wipe it back as freely, but that's okay. We're going to embrace the imperfections. I am then going to come along with that same stamp from the Reverie stamp design, the border stamp, and I'm just inking that up and adding that design here and there. I'm going to add that same stamp design that we did on the front to the back cover as well. And here's a look at the finished product. These turned out really well, and it was so fun to use the IOD stamps with that gold ink. Let me know which of these was your favorite. For our second project, I'm also painting the cover with Dixie Belle's Coffee Bean Chalk Mineral Paint as our base. I'm then going to be adding some IOD molds. I'm starting off with the frames mold, and I'm using some cornstarch in my molds, and then I'm adding some Jovi air dry clay, and you can see I just use my thumbs to press the clay out towards the micro rim. I'm then using an element from the Cameos mold and placing that in the center, and then I'm going to cast 2 of these corner pieces from the new Dainty Flourishes mold. Now this was an involved process, so I have sped up the video here for you guys. I'm then going to grab that smaller piece from the top of the Swags mold and also the lovely bow swag from the Swags mold as well, and we're going to position that just underneath the frame that I cast earlier. And then I'm also going to cast a couple of the sweet little birds from the Cameos mold as well. I'm then going to be casting a label from the Labels 2 mold. Again, this is an older design that I'm working with today, and I'm going to work my clay into the design and then carefully flex the mold to release. This one doesn't have a micro rim because it's an older one, so it was a little bit trickier. And then I'm going to use a strong wood glue to secure all of my pieces down. Remember, I will have a list of all the molds that I have used in these projects if I'm going a little bit too fast for you here. It's just this is a very long process, and this video would be super long if I let it go in real time. So I've got all of my molds glued to the front, and now I'm going to add that label mold to the spine. And then I'm going to come in with Dixie Belle's Coffee Bean Chalk Mineral Paint and carefully paint over the top of my castings. They've only been sitting for a couple of hours. They are still wet and fragile, so I am being very careful here. I do this because I find I get less cracking and less shrinking when I paint it. It slows down the drying process, which again helps with limiting the cracking and the shrinking. The next day, I am coming in with Dixie Belle's Drop Cloth Chalk Mineral Paint, and I'm going to paint over the top of my castings. Now, I want that black peeking through, but I do also want to be able to highlight the details of our castings with that white. So you'll see that I will go over the top of some of the castings with my brush, but I often do it when I have little paint on there. I don't want to overload it. So I'm going to work my way around and paint the castings with that drop cloth. To create a little bit more texture, I did speed up the drying process with a hairdryer. I then decided that I wanted to bring out those little birds again. I felt like they faded a little bit into the background, so I'm just using a small artist brush and some more of that coffee bean chalk mineral paint, and I'm going to go over the top of the birds. I also went in and tidied up the area on the center of the cameo design. Once the back was painted and the entire book dry, I used some of Dixie Belle's Au Naturel Voodoo Gel Stain and went over the top of my drop cloth paint. Now, I do not have a clear coat down here. Usually I do, but I want this to soak in unevenly. I want this to look old and worn. If you put a clear coat down, it's a lot more of an even coverage, if that makes sense. I want this to look very imperfect, very old and weathered. So I'm going to repeat the same process. I am working in small sections here though, so I do still have some control over the depth that this creates. If you don't have access to this product that I'm using, you could use some sort of an antiquing glaze to age up your project, or a wax, or you could create a paint wash with a similar looking color. To age the book pages a little bit further and hide some of my painting mistakes, I'm going to put some of that Voodoo gel stain on the book pages as well. Once that coat was dry, I grabbed some of Dixie Belle's Grunge Glaze and I went over the top of the book here. So this is going to add more of an antiqued look. Again, we're just building up those layers. And if this look was a little bit too subtle for you, you could come in with a wax. That would definitely be a more dramatic change in tone. To add to the aged effect, I grabbed IOD's Vintage Textures stamp, specifically the crackle stamp, and I'm just using some of IOD's permanent black ink, and I'm just going to go around and randomly press down on the stamp to get that crackle look. If you don't have this stamp, you could definitely try using some sort of a crackle medium instead. And you can see here I'm just using a baby wipe to wipe back some of the excess ink. This will fade that design a little bit more and make it look a little bit more realistic. I'm going to be repeating the same process on the spine of the book and the back. I wanted to add a touch of gold on this project too, so here I'm using some of Dixie Belle's gold gilding wax. I'm just getting a little bit on my finger and then I'm just going around and hitting the top parts of our castings. Finally, I decided that I would grab those Amazon stamps again and spell out the word enchantments. I did end up running out of room, so it does only say enchantment, but that's okay, you get the gist. So again, I'm just using some gold ink for my lettering here. And here's our finished enchantment book. I love how this turned out. Those IOD molds are so beautiful to work with, and I feel like this is definitely a lovely gothic piece that you could fit into your Halloween decor. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments. For our final book, you can see that I have grabbed the Labels 2 mold again, and I'm going to be casting 2 of this particular design here because I want to add them to the spine of the book. I know a lot of those older books had those sort of old hinges or those old straps on them, so that's what we're trying to replicate here. I've already painted my book in that coffee bean, and so I'm going to cast 2 of these, and then I'm also going to cast an additional mold from the Labels 1 mold, and this is going to be for the spine of the book. I'm then going to dust my plastic sheet with some cornstarch and add some of that cornstarch to my rolling pin, and I'm going to be rolling out some air dry clay. I'm getting it to about 1 to 2 mils thick, and then I'm going to position it on my book and work out how much of this I want to use. You can see I am just tearing off any excess clay that I don't want, and then I'm going to apply my wood glue to the book. I don't mind if I'm a bit messy here, I can always wipe that off soon. And I'm going to carefully press down. I'm then going to add those label molds that we created before. I'm adding a strong wood glue to those, and you can see I'm just going to carefully bend those around the book. You can definitely bend and manipulate your castings like this while they're still wet. It's best to do that while they're wet, otherwise they'll just crack if you try and do them after they've dried. You could try this technique with resin if you like, but then you would probably have to tape your molds in place while they're drying. I'm then going to prop my book up on a paint container so that I don't damage the underside of the molds, and you can see I'm just using a wet wipe to tidy up any excess glue. Just down here in the bottom left hand corner, I decided that I didn't want that mold overlapping with the clay, so I'm just tearing off some of the clay, and in tearing it off I'm still going to get that jagged rustic edge that I'm going for. And then I'm going to add some glue to the mold that we made for the spine of the book. I'm then going to cast 2 of these corner pieces from the Dainty Flourishes mold. In the center part of this book in our wet clay, I'm going to be using the Reverie stamp again, and I'm just positioning our angel lady in the center there, and then I'm pressing down. I'm not going to get a perfect impression here, and that's okay. I want it to look like a sort of ghostly spirit image, and I really feel like that was achieved here. And then I'm going to come in and just tear a little bit more clay away. I just wanted to add to that jagged edge, and then I'm going to glue down the corner pieces that we made earlier. Once I've done that, I'm going to paint over the top of my clay and my castings carefully with some of that coffee bean color. These are still wet, but remember, I like to do this to minimize the cracking and the shrinking. And once I have the entire book painted, I'll let it dry overnight. The next day, I came in with some of Dixie Belle's Burlap Chalk Mineral Paint, and just like on our previous book, I'm going to paint over the top of the black, but I still want some of that black peeking through. And I'm just going to run my brush lightly over some of the casting details so that we are highlighting those beautiful details. And I'm going to repeat the same process on the spine and the back of the book. Again, I'm just being gentle because I do have some castings on the underside of my book as well. Once my paint was completely dry, I used some of Dixie Belle's Best Dang Wax in Clear, and I'm going to cover the entire outside of the book with that wax. It's going to seal in our paint, but it's also going to be a great base for the dark wax that we're going to be using next. I'm then going to be using a small brush with some brown Best Dang wax on it to work that wax into the details, and then I'm using a microfiber cloth to buff back the excess, and you can see that that brown wax sits down nicely in all of those details. I'm also going to bring attention to the cracked and torn edges of the clay and the details of our castings. So I'm just going to repeat the same process of adding that lovely brown wax and then wiping back the excess in areas. And this is something that you can have a play with and experiment with how heavy you want your wax to be, or if you need to pull it back, you can use a little bit more clear wax, almost like an eraser. I'm using wax for this step, but you could use a glaze instead or a paint wash. To add to the center image and make it look a little bit more ghostly or spirit-like, I did come in with some of Dixie Belle's white Best Dang wax, and I just highlighted some of the details, and then I will buff back the excess. This is just a very subtle look. I'm then going to use those same Amazon stamps, but this time I'm using them with IOD's permanent black ink, and I'm going to spell out the word curses. Finally, I'm going to add some of Dixie Belle's gold gilding wax to some of the details. I also decided to add some of that Au Naturel Voodoo Gel Stain to the pages of my books. I am a bit of a messy crafter, and this helped to hide those paint marks. And here's our Curses book. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments. For my first project, I'm using this wood round that I got from Temu, and I'm going to be adding some clay. So first of all, I have dusted my plastic and my rolling pin with cornstarch, and now I'm rolling out my clay to about 1 to 2 mil thick, and I'm going to then position it on my wood round, and I'm going to have to do this a few times until I have my wood round covered. I don't need it completely covered. I like the jagged edge, and it will add to that Halloween feel that we're going for, but I'm just going to add the clay in bits and pieces. Remember, you can find a full product list in the description below and all of these products on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. So as you can see, I have rolled out some more clay and I'm just adding it in bits and pieces here and there, and then using my rolling pin to sort of smooth them and blend them together. I don't want this clay to be super thick, but it does need to be thick enough for us to be able to do some impressions with stamps. Next, I'm going to be attaching my clay to my wood round with a strong wood glue, and I'm just adding it in sections, just very carefully lifting up my clay and then putting it back down. Next, while my clay is still wet, I'm going to be using IOD's letterpress stamp, and right now I'm just putting out the words for a fun little Halloween rhyme that I saw on Pinterest, and I'm just pressing my stamps into the clay until I have an impression. I don't need it to be super deep or super defined. We're going for a rustic, whimsical Halloween look here, so I'm just going to work my way through until I have spelled out the entire little rhyme, and I'm just playing around with spacing, and if I make a mistake I can very carefully smooth out the clay, but definitely take your time with this and sort of plan ahead. You can see I sort of position the stamps before I do any pressing down. If you're going to give this project a try yourself, this is definitely something that you can customize. You don't have to use the same rhyme as I am. You can see here that I have just changed the font that I was using for the word Halloween, just to have a bit of emphasis on that. I'm then going to use an element from the Reverie stamp. I'm just using part of a stamp up the top there. And then I'm also using some of the swirls from the same stamp set. And you'll see I'll just have a bit of a play with a bunch of elements from that one. It really is quite a versatile design. So I'm just grabbing out what I think will be suitable. I'm sort of holding it up against my design. And then once I'm happy with it, I'm pressing it into the clay. Keep in mind that if you don't have clay or you don't want to use clay, but you still like the general look of this project, that you could definitely use ink or paint to stamp this design on your wood round instead of pressing it into clay. Before my clay has dried, I'm going to give it one coat of Dixie Belle's drop cloth chalk mineral paint. I like to do this as I find it minimizes shrinking and cracking. Not that I mind if I get some cracking in this project though, because it would just add to that spooky Halloween feel. As I'm painting, I am being careful not to let my paint pool in all of the details that we made with our impressions. I don't want to hide those. The next day, I came in with some of Dixie Belle's Best Dang Wax in clear, and I sealed the entire piece. This is going to seal and protect my paint, but it's also going to be a great base for our next step. Once I have the coverage that I want, I am going to use a microfiber cloth to buff off the excess. Next, I'm going to be using brown Best Dang Wax, and I have a smaller artist brush that I'm using to work that dark wax into the details that we created with our stamps. So I'm really working it in there, because once I have that coverage in there where I want it to go, we're going to wipe back some of that excess, and the clear wax underneath is going to give me the freedom to wipe back as much or as little as I want. You can see I'm also paying attention to the elements that we added, the florals and the swirls, and also any of the cracking as well, because I want this to have a really spooky feel. I used brown wax for this so I could highlight the details and the impressions that I created, but you could also try using a glaze or a paint wash for this step. Anywhere that my wax got a little bit dark and I was unable to wipe back as much as I wanted, I came back in with some of the clear wax, and this worked a little bit like an eraser. And anywhere that maybe I removed a little bit too much wax, I could always come back in and add a little bit more. This is just something that you will play with until you are happy with the result. To further highlight the details that we created with our stamp impressions and to give it a fun, vibrant feel, I'm adding some of Dixie Belle's gold gilding wax to the letters and some of the florals and the swirls that we created. So I'm just using a small artist brush to really concentrate that gold wax in those details. And if I go a little bit too heavy, I can always wipe it back with a baby wipe, as long as I'm pretty quick to do that. Now, if you don't have gold wax, maybe you could come in with some sort of a gold paint pen or maybe a glaze. I also added some of the gold gilding wax just around the edge for just a touch of shine. Finally, on the back, I'm going to attach a hook for hanging, but to do this, because of how thin my wood round is, I cannot use a screw, so I'm going to use Gorilla Super Glue Gel. This sticks really well, and because this is quite a light piece, I don't have any worries about it being able to hold the weight. And here's our finished Halloween sign. I love how this turned out. I think adding the stamps to the clay as impressions as opposed to just stamping them like normal gives the piece some real depth and dimension. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments. Our next project is a Pottery Barn dupe. I have a couple of these plastic pumpkins from a couple of seasons ago, and we're going to give them a makeover. My first step is to pour out some of Dixie Belle's coffee bean chalk mineral paint. This is a lovely black that has a hint of brown. I'm also adding sea spray texture additive to thicken up my paint and create some texture. Pottery Barn have these really beautiful black terracotta style pumpkins that we're going to try and replicate here today. So I started applying my mixture, but I really felt like I wasn't getting the texture that I wanted, so I switched to a natural bristle chip brush, and that really did the trick. So your brush really does have a lot to do with the texture you're going to create. So I'm going to work my way around the pumpkin and add our sea spray and coffee bean mix, and this is really creating a lovely terracotta stone sort of a look. So I'm going to cover the entire pumpkin. I did not do any sort of priming or anything on this. These are for my home, and I find that this chalk paint sticks really well, and it's just a decor piece. It is going to take 2 coats of this to get the coverage I want. Once my 2 coats were dry, I sealed my little pumpkin with some of my clear wax. I'm using a natural bristle brush for this. So this is going to seal our little pumpkin, but it's also going to be a great base for our next step. While my wax is still wet, I'm using some of Dixie Belle's Ash Dixie Dirt. It's just like the name sounds, it looks like ash. It's a lovely grey tone that contrasts nicely with our coffee bean. So this is what's going to give us that Pottery Barn look. It's going to make it look a little bit like weathered terracotta, and this will be something that you will add to your liking. You can add as much or as little as you want, but you do need to have wax or something down that the Dixie Dirt can stick to, so keep that in mind. I really tried to focus on the grooves and crevices on the pumpkin. I felt like the Dixie Dirt really brought out all those details beautifully, and I think that honestly, if you're not a fan of jack-o'-lanterns, you could just do this on a plain pumpkin as well, and I think that it's a lovely effect on that as well. If you don't have Dixie Dirt, you could try adding maybe a white wax. That might create something a little bit similar, or I've also seen some people using baking soda or baking powder to do this. And here's a look at the finished product. This was a quick and easy flip, but I feel like it was very effective, and I don't think these look like cheap little dollar store pumpkins anymore. Let me know if you think these look like the Pottery Barn ones. For our second pumpkin, I was inspired by some lighter weathered terracotta pumpkins that Pottery Barn has. So I'm applying a mixture of Dixie Belle's drop cloth chalk mineral paint that already has the sea spray mixture mixed into it. I started applying it by brushing it on, but I wasn't getting the look that I wanted. So I then started doing some dabbing and stippling instead. It's going to take 2 coats to get the coverage that I want on this pumpkin as well. Once my paint was dry, I used some of Dixie Belle's flat clear coat to seal my pumpkin, and we are also going to need this for our next step. The Pottery Barn pumpkin that I'm trying to recreate here had some weathering on it. It also had some moss, so I'm going to be using Au Naturel Voodoo Gel Stain. I've watered it down a little bit, and then I'm using a fan brush to add some of that age that has looked like it's built up around the bottom. So I'm just going to add it in random areas where I think that age would appear. And then I'm also going to use a paper towel to wipe back some of the excess. For the moss sort of a look, I'm going to be using Dixie Belle's Bayou Moss Voodoo Gel Stain, and I'm going to pour a little bit out and add a little bit of water, and I'm just going to repeat the same process as before, using my fan brush to add little bits of the product in random areas and then a paper towel to wipe back the excess. Now this is going to be to your liking. The Pottery Barn ones that I'm trying to recreate were very subtle. Again, this is going to be up to whatever look you want to achieve. Next, I'm going to add some Dixie dirt, but in order for it to stick, I need to add some easy peasy spray wax. So I'm just spraying that on, and then I'm going to be using the same Dixie dirt that we were using before in ash, and I'm going to get a little bit on my brush, and then I'm just going to sort of dab it on so that little bits of it fall off on the pumpkin. And this is going to be random. There's no wrong or right way to do this. It's however much you want to add. So I just sort of added it, and then you can also use a paper towel to wipe it back in certain areas. And here's a look at our second pumpkin. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I think that it is a sweet Halloween decoration, but that you could also turn it around and you could use this effect on just a plain pumpkin design if you wanted as well. Let me know what you think of this one in the comments. For our final project today, I'm going to be recreating the poison apple from Snow White. So I have this plastic apple. I think I bought it on eBay a few years ago. We're going to get out the cornstarch again, and I'm adding some to my plastic sheet and also to my rolling pin. I'm then going to take some of my Jovi air dry clay and I'm sort of pressing it out, and then I'm going to use my rolling pin to get it to about 2 mil thick. I don't want this too thin because this is going to be the poison that sits and sort of drips down our apple, so I don't want it to be too thin. So I'm going to keep going until I have it about the width that I want. Before I add the clay to my apple, I'm going to pull the little stem out. I can reattach that later. And then I'm going to carefully peel my clay up from the plastic sheet that I was rolling it on, and I'm going to start to mold it to my apple. So I'm going to very carefully be pressing it. You'll see that I do a little bit of folding and tearing of the clay so that it actually goes around the apple and starts to conform to the shape. And at this point, I'm just sort of trying to make sure that I have the coverage I want, because I am going to be tearing bits off because it's going to look like liquid pouring down. So I'm just going to keep shaping the clay until I'm happy with the basic design. So I'm just going to put some strong wood glue. This is a quick set glue, and I'm just using my finger to spread it all around. You can see that the red from the apple is transferring to the clay. I'm not worried about this because I'm going to be painting that clay as well. So I'm just rubbing that glue wherever the clay is going to go, and then I'm very carefully putting my clay back in place and then pressing down. Wherever my bits of clay sort of meet, I'm just using my fingers to smooth them together, and then I'm going to start ripping more clay off. I don't want the whole apple covered. It's meant to look like the poison dripping down. So I'm just working my way around and pulling the bits of clay together that need to be pulled together and tearing off the excess clay. I'm then turning the apple upside down and adding some more glue so that we can attach the excess bits that we have torn around the bottom. I'm then going to use a baby wipe to wipe off any excess glue. Now I need to cut out the eyes and the nose that appear on the poison apple. So I'm going to start with the nose, and I'm sort of making a triangle, and then down the bottom I'm sort of pulling the bottom part up a little bit, so it actually sort of looks like the nose in a skull. So I'm just using my craft knife to do that. Same with the eyes, I sort of cut out some oval shapes there, and then I'm just using the knife to very carefully pull the clay up and then pulling it out. And anywhere that I have a bit of excess glue showing, I use a baby wipe to clean that up. I don't want to have to paint the apple itself. I'm also going to use my craft knife to make the excess clay hanging down look a little bit more like dripping poison. So I'm just sort of curving the edges a little bit where I can. And again, this will be to your liking. It just depends what shape you want this to have. And you could also try this with paint if you wanted. I just feel like the clay was a lot easier to work with and to shape. I then grabbed the little stem from the apple and poked a hole before the clay had dried. When my clay had started to set, it's not completely dry, I gave it a few hours and then I came in with Dixie Belle's Cotton Chalk Mineral Paint. I really love the stark contrast of this paint with the red of the apple. You could definitely go with a green maybe to make it more obvious that it's poison. I just went with the white here because, like I said, I like the contrast. So I'm just using a small artist brush to apply the paint. This is going to reduce cracking and shrinking because I'm doing it before the clay has completely dried, and I'm just going to work my way around, and anywhere that I get excess paint I can always wipe that off. Once that had dried, I came in with another thick coat, and this time I'm trying to mimic the liquid sort of drippy look, and I've got my paint really thick here and I'm applying it really thick, and then I'm going to speed up the drying process to add to that texture. Once my paint was completely dry, I added the little stem for the apple back where it was before. And here's our finished poison apple. This was such a fun project, and I've always really loved Snow White. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. Our next project is this little sign that I thrifted. I always grab these when I can because I know I can paint over them. After cleaning, I am going to use my drill to remove the hanging from the back, and then I'm going to give it 2 coats of Dixie Belle's Drop Cloth Chalk Mineral Paint. I'm going to be painting the front and the sides of this piece. While my paint is drying, I'm going to add some cornstarch to a little plastic mat that I've got there, and then I'm going to start pulling out some Jovi air dry clay. You can see I'm just shaping that a little bit, and then I'm going to grab my rolling pin and add a little bit of cornstarch to that, and I'm going to start rolling out my clay. I'm going to roll it out until it's about 2 mil thick approximately. It doesn't matter if some areas are a little bit thicker than others. All that matters is that it's approximately the right size to to cover our sign. So once I have that rolled out, I'm going to very carefully pull it up from our little plastic sheet there and position it over the top of our sign. I don't want it to completely cover. I like the jagged edges there. I'm going to carefully pull off the excess. You can see that I'm tearing it. I don't want it to be perfect. We want this to look a little bit primitive, so I'm just pulling that off wherever it's overlapping. And once I have that in position, we can move on to our next step. I'm going to be using IOD's Fruitful Harvest stamp. I'm going to be using the smaller pumpkin design from that stamp, and I'm pressing that down into the clay. We're going to be creating an impression today. So I'm applying some pressure so that all of those details are going to show up, and then I'm going to carefully pull my stamp away. Now you can see some of the outlines of the stamp here, so I'm just going to use my finger to very lightly smooth out those excess lines. And then I'm going to be using another element from the Fruitful Harvest stamp, this little leaf. So I'm going to press it down, but I'm not going to press the entire thing. I only want part of that leaf to be showing, so I'm only applying pressure up the top of the pumpkin, and that way then I won't get any of the other pieces as an impression. So I'm just pressing down, and then I'll carefully pull that away. And then I decided that I was going to use another element from the same stamp. So again, I'll only press down on the sections that I want to have an impression from. I don't want to ruin that little pumpkin that we've already done. And again, just using my fingers to smooth out any of those excess lines that I don't want. I'm going to add a couple of the little vines down the bottom. You can see that I've swapped to the larger leaf stamp from that pack, and I'm just playing around. I'm adjusting the different angles and working out what parts of the stamp that I want, because you don't have to use these stamps as is. You can use bits and pieces of them. Down the bottom, I still had a little bit of excess clay, so I'm just using my fingers to carefully pull off some of that excess. Again, I don't want it to be a perfect line. I want it to look jagged and primitive. To secure my clay in place, I'm going to very carefully lift up the edge, and then I'm going to apply a generous amount of a strong wood glue. I'm applying it, and then I'm going to use my finger to spread it all out so that every part of my clay will have really good contact and will be adhered well. I'm going to work in sections, being careful not to move my clay too much. We don't want it to tear. So I'm going to the other side and I'm repeating the same process. You definitely want to make sure that you have enough glue to keep that all held down. Once I have all my clay glued down, I'm going to use a wet wipe to wipe up any excess glue, and then I'm going to allow this to dry for 24 hours before moving on to my next step. And here we are the next day. You can see some cracks have formed. Now, I'm not worried about that because it goes perfectly with the look that we're going for. I'm now coming in with Dixie Belle's Drop Cloth Chalk Mineral Paint. I'm going to apply just one coat. If I didn't want those cracks to appear, I could have painted my clay before it was completely dry. It would have slowed down the drying process and I would have got less cracks, but I actually wanted the cracks for this project. When my paint was completely dry, I sealed the entire piece with Dixie Belle's Gloss Clear Coat. When my clear coat was completely dry, I used some of Dixie Belle's Au Naturel Voodoo Gel Stain. I'm just pouring a little bit out and I'm going to use a brush to apply it to the front of my piece first. I'm going to be working in sections. You can see I'm really working it down into the details that we created with our stamp impressions and also the edges of our clay and all those beautiful cracks. So I'm applying that and then I'm going to use a baby wipe to dab off the excess. This is going to create a really beautiful old world sort of a look here. I'm also going to repeat the same process on the sides of the piece as well. When that was dry, I came in with Dixie Belle's Clear Best Dang Wax. Now, I did have a sealer down originally, but we have come in with another product over the top, and I want to make sure that I'm going to be able to move around my brown wax that we're going to add next. So I'm just adding this down as a little bit of insurance. I'm going to buff off the excess with a microfiber cloth. Next, I'm going to add some of Dixie Belle's Brown Best Dang Wax. I started with a larger brush and changed to a smaller one so that I could get down into all of those cracks and crevices. So I'm really working it into all of the details. And once I have it where I want it to go, I'm going to use a wet wipe again to wipe back the excess. And it is absolutely beautiful how that wax brings out the details of those IOD stamps and also the cracks and the edges of our clay. Now, I could have used a brown glaze for this step instead of the wax, but I really like the intensity that this wax brings, so I felt like this was a better option. If you don't have access to this sort of wax, you could definitely use a glaze, or you could create a brown paint wash. I'm also adding that brown wax to the sides of the sign. And here's a look at our finished project. I love how this turned out. I feel like it's a really subtle, beautiful piece for Halloween or fall, and I feel like it really shows the beautiful details of those IOD stamps. Let me know what you think of this project in the comments. I really hope that you enjoyed this video collection, and you can find the products used in this video on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. If you haven't already, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button, like, comment, and share this out to a friend that you think might enjoy it.